Thank you for joining me for another episode of Tryp Rapport. On today's episode, we're going to talk about my first experience with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca has gotten a lot of notoriety recently. A big person coming forward was Aaron Rodgers, who spoke out about his experience, saying that it provided a lot of healing, and he went on to be the MVP for 2 back-to-back seasons afterwards. Will Smith also came out and talked about how it provided him a better way to cope with fame, healing, etc., but clearly he didn't purge all of his anger through his ayahuasca experience. Ron White was another interesting one. I mean, everybody knows him from the Blue Collar Comedy Tour, the guy who always had a drink in his hand. He owns a tequila company, but he cleared his depression, anxiety, and he completely quit drinking after his experience with ayahuasca. The other comedian that I thought was really interesting was Neil Brennan. He actually even put a comedy special out called 3 Mics or something like that, where he detailed his struggle with depression. Now, he's been on Joe Rogan's podcast multiple times over the years, and it seems like every time he came on there, he had some other new breakthrough treatment that he was trying for his depression, and it always had a little bit of effect, but then he was back to square one by the next time he was on the podcast. And that's things like EMDR, ketamine therapy, all of that. But on his most recent Joe Rogan podcast, he talked about how he had finally done ayahuasca. And I had heard another podcast with him that just came out a couple weeks ago, and he said that it's been 1 year since his encounters with ayahuasca and that he's still completely depression free. So ayahuasca is a very, very powerful plant medicine. So ayahuasca, for those who don't know, it's a combination of plants. So the actual ayahuasca, the ayahuasca vine, which is Banisteriopsis caapi, is what contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. This inhibitor is what allows the DMT from the other plant to cross the blood-brain barrier. So the second plant is Psychotria viridis, also known as chacruna, and that's what contains the dimethyltryptamine, otherwise known as DMT, which is a tryptamine-based psychedelic, not unlike psilocybin or LSD. So if one were to consume the chacruna or any DMT containing plant for that matter on its own, you have this monoamine oxidase in your system which breaks that DMT down and doesn't allow it to cross the blood-brain barrier. There are a lot of plants in nature that contain DMT, so if we didn't have this, which is probably something that came from evolution, then anytime we consumed a DMT containing plant, we would go into a full-blown psychedelic trip. So it has its purpose. Now, there are something like over 2,000 species of plants in the Amazon, and I've heard people quote this multiple times, but it's pretty crazy to think that these tribal communities of the Amazon figured out how to combine 2 of these plants to create this unbelievable psychedelic mixture that has all of these profound healing properties. When I first became interested in psychedelics and was researching and settled on psilocybin, ayahuasca was often on the radar. I had read about the possibility of the purging associated with it, with the vomiting and all that sort of thing, but it didn't really worry me at the time. As I was looking more and more into it, I found a recording on YouTube of somebody. They weren't allowed to film in the ceremony, but they brought audio recording equipment in and documented the whole ceremony, and it sounded horrific. I mean, there were people crying, screaming, vomiting. It just sounded terrible. It sounded like everybody was going through hell. And when I listened to that, it really turned me away from it. I was like, I don't know that I need to do this, because to this point, I mean, mushrooms have been pretty pleasant, so I don't know that ayahuasca is what I need. Over the years, I kept seeing these accounts of miraculous healing of incurable diseases. So my interest started to peak again, because I had recently been diagnosed with lupus, and I had to wonder, this autoimmune disease that although it can be pushed into remission, can it be cured? And is it possible? I mean, I've read it a million times that they believe that a lot of autoimmune conditions, especially things like fibromyalgia, are a manifestation of trauma into the body. So the question for myself was, is this all in my head? So I thought, if there's one thing that might be able to purge this out, maybe ayahuasca is what I need to do. This was another prime example of what I've said on here multiple times, that you don't find plant medicines, they find you when you're ready. Because when I did decide that I wanted to do it, there's of course the places out there like Rhythmia and the main retreat centers that are down in Peru and Costa Rica, where you got to pay a couple grand and they put you up for a week and you do ayahuasca and other plant medicines back to back. At the time, I couldn't afford it, so it just didn't seem like it was the right fit for me. Although I was setting money aside and trying to figure out when it could work into my schedule, it was just one of those things where it hadn't worked out. Now, my lady was in residency at the time, and one of her colleagues, they were both talking about plant medicines, and she said that she had recently done ayahuasca and had a wonderful experience with it. So she got the contact information from the people who she went through and got it for me. And I thought, you know what? I mean, it's pretty random that this just came into my life while I've been seeking it. So I reached out and got set up. And a few weeks later, this is right when I had started treatment with Combo, which is supposed to be pretty good for autoimmune disease as well. And when I was talking with my Combo practitioner after one of the sessions, I had told him that I was getting ready to do ayahuasca, and he asked who it was with. And when I mentioned the name of the facilitator, he said, "Oh man, she is wonderful." He said he had actually was a facilitator with her a few times. And he said, although it's not a traditional ceremony like you may see in the rainforest, it is one of the best ayahuasca ceremonies I've ever experienced. And he said, if you don't like what you take away from it, or if it's not what you think you were looking for with an ayahuasca experience, he was like, I can set you up with somebody else local who does a more traditional ceremony. And I said, cool. So that's, another person. This is now the second person who recommended this experience. And so I figured I was in good hands and I was ready for it. So we fast forward to the day of the ceremony, and it was actually 8/19 of 2020. And it's interesting because whenever I had opened up my journal to start journaling about the ayahuasca experience, I realized that my last psychedelic experience was the LSD experience that I talked about previously, which is 1 year exactly prior to this date. So I kind of feel like that wasn't much of a coincidence either, that it was a full year off of this, and then I finally dove back into, the deep end with the ayahuasca. The entry that I had in the journal, which I like to do before all experiences, is jot down my intentions. So my first intention was to try to figure out this autoimmune issue, like why my body kicked into it, why my body was fighting itself. Is there a way to clear it? Just try to get more details around that. The second was to purge military trauma. I feel like I've got through quite a bit of it with psilocybin, but I was wondering if there was anything left. And, if I had to get it out, I figured I'd get it out because the lupus did start immediately following my first Iraq deployment. So I thought maybe there's some trauma from that sparked the autoimmune disease. So let's try to figure that out. The third intention was to look for childhood trauma. This was on my radar because I'd often heard people over the years talk about, oh, when I was 2 years old, this happened, or when I was 3 years old, this happened. And I was like, do you really remember when you were 2 or 3 years old? That always just seems so crazy to me because I had a vague recollection of elementary school, but prior to that, I pretty much didn't have any memories. And so I thought it was normal that everybody, as you age, you just kind of only have so much room in your brain and you purge out the other stuff. But it made me wonder, like, is there a reason that I blacked out everything pre-elementary school? And so I decided I would try to dive in there a little deeper. And the last intention that I had was just to get comfortable in my own skin, because that was one of the things that had come up in the previous LSD experience, was the not having love for myself. And so I decided that was probably a good intention to look further into. So this is all jotted down, and then it was drove up to the mountains. Everybody was supposed to be there at 3 p.m. and then we sat together at 5 p.m. and they pretty much put out the ground rules saying, once the ceremony begins, no one's allowed to leave. Everybody stays inside. If you feel the need to step outside and get some air, you need to let somebody know, to try to keep the sound purging to a minimum so that you're not impacting the experiences of others. Just explaining to focus on your intention, and they explained, swapping out puke buckets, all that kind of stuff. So they went through the ground rules, and then 5:30 was when the ceremony actually began. So the facilitator looked around the room. I guess I'm assuming kind of assessing everybody by size, weight, etc. But maybe she was able to see the dose based on some outwardly experience that I don't know otherwise. But either way, she looked around the room and poured the dose for everybody and then went around and handed them out. And then went around the room and had everybody kind of state their intentions, their blessings, things along those lines. And we all cheersed and consumed the first cup. Now, one thing I had heard repeatedly about ayahuasca is how horrific the flavor is. People said it's like dirt mixed with trash, and I've heard every different explanation of it across the board, but it was always a bad one. And I took a swig and expecting the worst, and honestly, it was not bad at all. I mean, the best summary that I would have of it would be kind of a mixture of molasses and cough syrup. So it's like if you've taken a shot of Jaeger in your life, you will have no problem getting ayahuasca down, at least from this practitioner. I know everybody brews it differently. There's different admixtures, and I have heard other people say that have been with this practitioner that it's the best tasting brew that they've ever had. And other people had told me prior to my experience that she also produced the strongest brew that they've ever had. And she did say before pouring all the cups for everybody that she had just gotten back from brewing this brew out of the country and that this was the strongest batch that she had brewed to date. So that made me a little bit nervous, thinking like, okay, I'm not only am I getting in this, but everybody said this is the strongest stuff that's out there. So I'm really going for it. After everybody consumed the first cup, they began with a 15-minute silent meditation. And so I just kind of sat back, closed my eyes, focused on my intentions, and was waiting to see some change. After the 15 minutes, the music began, and it was still probably another 30 minutes once the music was playing that I finally started to see some very light visuals. And they were, identical to mushrooms, but just not as vivid with color or vivid as in like the sharpness of the imagery. Now, it was about this time that everybody around me started losing their shit. It was vomiting, crying, weird breathing patterns. The one guy was sliding forward and back, like rubbing his thighs with his hands. It was odd. So I had to question myself. I was like, did I drink the same thing as the rest of these people? And just looking around and everybody was losing it. I was the only one still sitting there somewhat coherent. The message that came through right out the gate that I ended up writing in the journal is that people still plugged into the matrix simply cannot decipher the knowledge that's given to them. And then I have health, media, etc. written down. And I think this maybe came through because I was in the ceremony at like the peak COVID time, like the lockdown had just kicked off, and they actually postponed the ceremony a couple times because of the lockdown. And so like sitting back and watching everybody, having a girlfriend who is a doctor and understands what's going on with this virus and what masks are capable of, and just seeing the, quote unquote sheep go through just everything that the media had to come out to tell them, it was almost scary. And that was kind of what it showed me, was having already had a lot of mushroom experience, what it does. And I tell people this all the time, before you've had a psychedelic experience, you are closed-minded. And I know people don't like that term, or they think it's an insult of sorts, and it's not. But until you can step out of your own body and get out of your own programming that you spent so many years putting in there, you believe what you were raised to believe. So whether you want to go the political side and you go red or blue or whatever you want to drop it back down to, is you have your own belief structure, and it's very unlikely for you to be able to see the other side until you can step out of your body. And that's one of the biggest changes I've seen with myself, is that I can take in information from every different side, weigh it in, and then choose, okay, this is what I'm going to believe. Or, I'm always open to see every side of a story. And what I've noticed is most people who haven't gone through these experiences are unable to do so. So I'd written in my journal that the first few hours were actually quite boring. I thought to myself, like, this is just way overpriced mushrooms, because the visuals were so similar, but not as vivid, and the headspace wasn't really crazy. I mean, it was like the same normal messages coming through. And I thought, man, like, I guess I didn't need this. And I'd heard Dennis McKenna say that ayahuasca isn't more powerful than mushrooms. Mushrooms are just based on the dosage. Like if you eat 20 grams of mushrooms, that's way more potent than any ayahuasca experience. So I thought to myself, was it really worth doing this, or did I just waste a ton of money? But the other thing that I realized or noticed while I was starting to work my way into that zone was that I was just super uncomfortable. My whole body hurt. I couldn't relax. I looked around, and I think in the email for prep, it said to bring a yoga mat and some cushions or something to be able to sit yourself upright. And I showed up with just that, like a yoga mat, a couple pillows, and that was all. And I looked around the room, and a lot of other people had these big elaborate cushions and things set up to really give themselves a comfortable space. And I didn't have that, and I felt terrible through it. So I just kind of moving back and forth, couldn't sit still, couldn't get comfortable. And then there were definitely a few occasions where I was like, man, I wish I had my own headphones, or I was allowed to turn my phone on and listen to music right now, because I just didn't align with some of the music that they were playing when the ceremony started. So a couple hours go by, and the second dose is offered. I would guess it's about the 2.5 hour mark that they offer the second cup. I wasn't sure how to go about getting a second cup, so I kind of sat back and watched other people go for it first. And so instead of her walking around the room and handing the doses out to everybody, you were expected to go up, sit in front of the facilitator, and request the second dose. So I watched a few people do it, and then I didn't want to be eager and jump the line, so I waited till there was a little lull, and I jumped up and got myself the second cup. And I came, laid back down. Another 30 minutes went by, and nothing. Not nothing, but I didn't seem to go any deeper than where I was currently sitting. So I decided to go hit the restroom, and I got up, walked down there, and looked in the mirror whenever I was in the restroom after I had washed my hands, and I saw that my pupils were super dilated. I mean, it looked like a cartoon character. But I've had interest in looking in the mirror on high-dose psilocybin experiences previously, because it's interesting to see yourself from essentially a new set of eyes. But this time, I was so disconnected from this creature that it was like I was looking at an alien, and I'm just like looking at my face and, body and everything else, and was like, man, what are these weird alien bodies that we're in? So it's interesting to think that looking at a human being, which is what I've been my entire life, felt alien. And so that thought process is like, okay, this consciousness does go somewhere else and probably incarnates into a bunch of different bodies. And so that's why this human body that I'm in, although it's been, I guess at the time, 35 years or so, it still was such a small amount of time for how long my soul has been around. So very bizarre. And then I cracked a smile, and it was very bizarre. It was almost as if that smile unlocked something, and I felt kind of the energy shift, and then made my way back to the ceremony room and to my mat. And that's when things started getting interesting. Immediately, a bunch of the LSD messages came flooding back to me. It was, telling me things like, oh, my girlfriend's the best thing that's ever happened to me. She's so full of love. She makes me feel so loved. And then it came in with the darkness, and it was like, but you're still too closed off to truly express your love for her. And then I thought to myself, man, I really hope she feels as loved by me as I do by her. And then that thrust me right back to ex-wife stuff again. And it basically showed me that she was a very important teacher in my life, but that unfortunately it was to her expense. And I just felt super shitty for her having to be in a relationship with somebody who was so incapable of showing love that, I drove us apart in the end. And I just thought to myself, if this thing does keep reincarnating and we do have these soul groups, I mean, hopefully I can make it up to her in a future life. And then came interaction, or I guess messages surrounding my dog, Toki. And what it told me was like, he really is, when you hear dogs are man's best friend, like that he really was my best friend. And then it took the dark turn as it kept going light and dark on me. And I just felt so terrible for every time that I disciplined him throughout all of his puppy years, whether it was yelling at him or smacking him on the butt or something like that. I just felt so bad, because animals, they have nothing but unconditional love. Every time you walk in the house, they're just, smiling ear to ear, tail wagging, so excited to see you. And I thought to myself, like, I can't believe I ever instilled any amount of fear or pain in this beloved animal. And yeah, it kind of bummed me out. But the message that came through from that was just that animals are so much more forgiving than people. And I think that's a lesson that we all need to mimic, is their animals' ability to forgive. The message that came through as well was that just I need to give him as much love as I can in what life he has remaining on this planet. I mean, he's becoming an older dog, and I don't know how many more years I have with him. And so what it said was just, cherish every last moment you get with him and give him as much love as you can. And I thought, well, maybe I get him certified as a service dog so that I can take him more places with me and, can spend more time with him, which I ultimately ended up doing. But it was an interesting message to come through. And then it said, I need to take him to the beach more because that's his happy place. So that kind of came through. Mind you, through all of this, like I said, it's going light and dark with the messages. And through all of it, my body was just getting more and more uncomfortable. So through all this, whether it was happy or sad thoughts or whatever, I just couldn't sit still. No matter which position I laid in, I just hurt. And it was so uncomfortable and annoying. And I thought, man, I didn't set myself up for this. Like, this is my problem. I should have packed more stuff. I should have, known. And mind you, there's no way I could have known what I was preparing for. So what happened for a reason. And I don't know, this all gets very interesting when we get into night 2. After dealing with everything with Toki, I had some flashbacks to like the elementary/middle school era. And I just had the feeling like I never fit in. And because of that, I started to play a character where I would dress or act in certain ways that didn't draw attention to myself. So I would just try to fit in so that I could stay low key, off bullies' radars, and not worried about any impactful things coming my way. And then what it showed me was I became so worried about what other people thought of me and staying under the radar that it became the detriment to some of my friends, like people who were actually friends of mine in elementary school. As we transitioned to middle school, which going from a Catholic to a public school, there were situations where those friends of mine were getting picked on, and instead of having their back, I would kind of take the bully side just to steer the aggression toward them instead of having it come back on me. And I was like, man, that's just a dick move. And I was bummed out about all that and thought about a few friends in particular who I had done that to. And then after I was bummed out on it, we then got back to like the positive side, and it showed me that I made up for some of that karma in the later middle school years, where there was one of the autistic kids that was a new transplant to the school. I befriended him, and a lot of times when people would try to talk shit, I would shut it down and make sure that he was taken care of. And yeah, it was almost like, okay, you learned your lesson there, but I still don't know that the karma was balanced out with that one. So after all that, which, made me feel kind of shitty that I was playing a character and doing what was best for me and not looking out for people around me, not treating others the way I wanted to be treated, it did go a little bit positive from there. The music, there was a lot of acoustic guitar stuff. And let me tell you, even though I said at the beginning that I wished I had had headphones before it really kicked in, the music was unbelievable. All of the facilitators, there were 4 of them, they were all unbelievably talented musicians, and they cycled through probably 40 different instruments. And so it was just all across the board, all different kind of sound healing. And one of the musicians was an unbelievable acoustic guitar player. And when he was playing the acoustic guitar, that thrust me back to being in childhood again. And my older brother and I sitting there, and my dad playing acoustic guitar and singing to us. And it was just such a beautiful moment. And it was one of those things that I feel like I probably took for granted for so many years, but him just willing to sit there and share music and the love that's associated with it. It was just a really good feeling to look back on, spending with my dad and my brother. And then it transitioned to another visual of my older brother and I playing with micro machines as a kid. And it showed me that myself holding an F-18 micro machine. And it was such a trip because fast forward 15 years or so, whatever it is, and I'm an F-18 mechanic. So pretty crazy. I mean, I guess it could just be a coincidence, but yeah, to have this playing with this little micro machine, flying this airplane around, and then ending up working on those years later. It wasn't anything that I'd planned on doing. It just kind of all fell into place, but it was a bizarre little coincidence that that vision came through for me. So it was nice to have those happy memories and the playful side of ayahuasca to come through, but then out of nowhere, things took a hard, dark turn. And I just see this flash, this vision of myself attacking the neighbor kid from next door at a young age. And although it was, these aren't like crystal clear visions like you watch it on TV, but you experience it. It's hard to explain, but I knew that it was me and like my foot kicking the neighbor kid from next door. And the scariest part was that I could feel all of the anger, like the guttural seeing red. Like I can't think of any time in my entire life that I was that angry since. And so to feel that in my core, it was scary. Like I didn't know what was going on, and it kind of freaked me out because I don't remember this fight. I didn't know anything about it, and it just flashed it in front of my eyes. And then I hear the facilitator say, "Okay, everybody, take a sip of water. Ceremony's ending. We're going to land the ship." And the vision was gone. And I was like, I don't think it's over. Like this just to come through right now. I feel like I've only been scratching the surface, and now we've hit the weird stuff. And sure enough, the visions were all done. I sipped the water and everything started to work its way down. Just confused. I didn't know what was going on, why that vision had come through. So I sipped some water, got back to the point where I was comfortable enough to get up, walk around, went back to the restroom. And then I decided I was going to sleep in my car for the night. And it was perfect because having a station wagon, I can just lay down and have my head propped at the back to look up through the rear window. And so I just watched the stars, and yeah, it was, being up in the mountains, it was just beautiful stargazing. And I had headphones in and just listened to some music. And I probably was still in that like headspace, like the trippy visual headspace for another hour and a half or so, but no more downloads came through. It was just kind of monitoring, like watching the stars, watching the visuals, and listening to music. So the other thing that was very interesting to me was that there was no purging at all. There was no vomiting. So I remember writing in my journal before all this started, I was curious, when people talk about ayahuasca and the vomiting, I was like, is it really? Because I've heard people say that the purging is tied to trauma. So when you're throwing up trauma. You're not just throwing up the ayahuasca that's turning in your stomach. And I was like, yeah, I guess I'll be the judge of that. And so interestingly enough, after 2 cups of ayahuasca and a whole bunch of, bizarre visions, I did not throw up, and I didn't even feel like I needed to throw up. So that was reassuring that, okay, if the purges do come, then it's probably pretty likely that they are attached to something, because I wasn't the only one that didn't vomit. There were a couple other people who didn't throw up as well, but there was a lot of purging that night. So we're at about the 30-minute mark. I don't want to push this one too long, so I'll just go ahead and split these 2 nights up and do night 2 of ayahuasca on the second one. I have a couple guests lined up that I'm hoping to get in this week. If for some reason I can't get either of them in, then I'll just try to go ahead and get night 2 of ayahuasca recorded before the weekend. Until then, thanks for joining me. Take care. Love you guys.